The man said, "That's my father in there." And the funeral director closed the door. His hands shook, his wallet fell, and $300 scattered across the Los Angeles sidewalk in the October wind. Dean Martin pulled his car to the curb and watched the man drop to his knees. Wait, because the $500 Dean gave that stranger wasn't charity. And 3 days later, when Dean sat in the back row of that funeral and heard what the dead man's grandson said, an 8-year secret Dean had carried finally made sense. The afternoon was gray and cool, the kind of October day that makes Los Angeles feel like a real city instead of a movie set. Dean had been driving back from a meeting at NBC, alone, no driver, just him and the road, and an hour before he had to be at the Sands. He'd taken Sunset instead of the freeway because he liked the slow pace, the old neighborhoods, the feeling of being nobody for 20 minutes. He saw the funeral home first. White stucco, black awning, brass handles on the double doors. Then he saw the two men on the front steps, one in a black suit, 50s, slicked hair, arms crossed. The other in a brown work jacket, maybe 50, maybe older, holding a wallet open like he was showing identification. Dean slowed the car. He didn't know why. Maybe the way the man in the brown jacket was standing, shoulders hunched, head down, the posture of someone who's been hit and is waiting for the next blow. The funeral director's voice carried across the street. "The total is $800, sir. We've already prepared the body." The man in the brown jacket pulled bills from his wallet, counted them, counted again. His hands were shaking. "I have 300, he said. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "I can get more. I just need a few days. We require payment before the service. That's my father in there." The funeral director didn't move. "I understand, sir, but our policy is clear." Dean pulled to the curb and cut the engine. He sat there, hands on the wheel, watching. "Please," the man said, and the word came out broken. "He's been there for 3 days. I've been working double shifts. I just need—" "I'm sorry, sir." The funeral director stepped back into the doorway. "When you have the full amount, we can proceed." The door started to close. The man lunged forward, hand out, trying to stop it. "Wait, please, just—" The door clicked shut. For maybe 5 seconds, the man just stood there, arm extended, wallet in his other hand. Then his legs gave out. Not dramatically, not like he'd been shot, just a slow collapse. Knees hitting concrete, and he sat back on his heels with his head down and his shoulders shaking. The wallet slipped from his fingers and hit the pavement. $300 in 20s and 10s spilled out, and the October wind caught them. They lifted, spun, scattered down the sidewalk like leaves. The man didn't move, didn't reach for them, just sat there with his hands over his face. Dean opened his car door. He walked across the street and started picking up the bills. A 20 against a fire hydrant, 2 10s wrapped around a parking meter, a 5 in the gutter. He collected them all, smoothed them out, folded them once. Then he walked to where the man was kneeling. "Sir." The man didn't look up. Dean knelt beside him. Up close, he could see the man's hands, call-used, scarred, the hands of someone who'd worked with them his whole life. His jacket was old, elbows patched with different fabric. His boots were worn through at the toes. "Sir," Dean said again, quieter. The man lowered his hands. His face was red, wet, aged beyond its years. He looked at Dean, and for a moment there was no recognition, just the blank stare of someone who's run out of options. Then his eyes focused. "You're—" He stopped, shook his head. "I'm sorry. I'm fine. I just need a minute." "I've got your money," Dean said. He held out the folded bills. The man stared at them. "Thank you." He took them with both hands, like they were made of glass. "I'm sorry you had to see that. Don't be." The man stood slowly, using the wall for support. "How much do you need?" Dean asked. The man's jaw tightened. "I'll figure it out." "How much?" A long silence. The man looked at the funeral home doors, then at the bills in his hands, then at Dean. 500, he said quietly. I've been saving for 2 months. I work at a plant in Vernon. I can get it. I just need more time, and they won't. His voice caught. He can't just stay there. He deserves better than that. Dean reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He counted out 5 $100 bills and held them out. The man stared at the money. I can't take that. Yes, you can. You don't even know me. I know you're trying to bury your father, Dean said. That's enough. Listen to this part carefully, because what happened next is what separated Dean Martin the performer from Dean Martin the man, and it's the part almost nobody ever saw. The man took the money with shaking hands, and he looked at Dean with tears running down his face, and he said, I'll pay you back. And Dean said, No, you won't. And the man said, Yes, I will, I promise. Just give me your name, and I'll... And Dean cut him off. My name doesn't matter, he said. Go bury your father. The man stood there, holding the money like he didn't know what to do with it. Dean could see him trying to speak, trying to find words that made sense, but nothing came out except a sound that was half sob, half exhale. What was his name? Dean asked. What? Your father. What was his name? The man blinked. Henry Castellano. Dean nodded. When's the service? Friday, 2 o'clock. The man wiped his face with the back of his hand. Why? Just asking, Dean said. He turned to walk back to his car. Wait. The man's voice stopped him. At least tell me your first name, so I know who to thank. Dean looked back. The man was holding the money against his chest, eyes red, face desperate for something to hold on to. Dean, he said. Thank you, Dean. The man's voice broke on the words. I don't know how to... my father would have... He always said there were still good people, and thank you. Dean nodded once and walked back to his car. He sat behind the wheel for a minute, hands shaking slightly, and watched the man go back to the funeral home doors and knock. This time, when the director opened them, the man held up the money. The director counted it, nodded, and stepped aside to let him in. Dean started the engine and drove away. He didn't tell anyone about it. Not his manager, not Frank, not Sammy. When they asked why he was quiet that night at the Sands, he just did his show, sang his songs, made people laugh, and went back to his hotel room alone. On Friday at 1:30, Dean drove back to that funeral home. He parked down the street and walked to the entrance. The service was small, maybe 20 people, all of them looking like they'd come straight from work. Factory workers, construction guys, a few women in simple black dresses. Dean slipped into the back row and sat. The man from the sidewalk stood at the front next to the casket. He'd cleaned up, shaved, put on a dark suit that looked borrowed. His hands were folded in front of him, and even from the back Dean could see them shaking. A priest said some words. Then the man himself stepped forward to speak. He talked about his father, Henry Castellano, immigrant from Sicily, worked in a steel mill for 40 years, raised 5 kids in a 2-bedroom house, never missed a day of work, even when his back gave out and he could barely walk, sent all 5 kids to school, made sure they had food every night, even when he didn't eat himself, died alone in a county hospital because he refused to burden anyone with his medical bills. The man's voice cracked when he said that last part. He stopped, took a breath, kept going. My father believed in 3 things, he said. Family, hard work, and helping people who needed it. He used to say, you measure a man by what he does when nobody's watching, and I failed him. I couldn't even... He stopped again, wiped his eyes. I couldn't even pay for this. 3 days he laid in that place, and I couldn't come up with $800. Some stranger had to give it to me, because his own son couldn't. He broke down, couldn't finish. His wife stood and put her arm around him and walked him back to the pew. Remember this moment, because this is where Dean Martin had to sit in the back of a funeral home and listened to a man blame himself for something that wasn't his fault. And Dean knew exactly how that felt, because he'd been carrying the same weight for 8 years. After the service, people filed past the casket. Dean stayed in his seat. He wasn't family. He didn't belong here. He started to stand up and leave when a kid approached him. Maybe 16, 17, wearing a suit that was too big for him. "Excuse me," the kid said. "Are you Dean?" Dean nodded. "I'm Anthony. That's my grandfather." He gestured toward the casket. "My dad said someone named Dean helped him. Is that you?" "Yes." The kid sat down in the pew beside him. "Thank you. My dad's been beating himself up about the money. He worked double shifts for 2 months and still couldn't make it. If you hadn't," he stopped. "Anyway, thank you. Your grandfather must have been a good man." "He was." The kid smiled slightly. "He had this thing he always said. A man who doesn't bury his father right carries that shame forever." He said it about his own father. "My great-grandfather died back in Sicily, and my grandfather couldn't afford to go back for the funeral. He was here, working, trying to feed his family. Never forgave himself for it." Dean's chest tightened. The kid kept talking. "He used to tell me and my brothers, 'When I die, you make sure I get buried right. I don't care what it costs. You do it right, because I couldn't do it for my father, and I carried that my whole life." The kid's voice wavered. "And my dad almost couldn't do it. Almost. If you hadn't shown up, I'm glad I could help," Dean said quietly. The kid looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why'd you do it? You didn't know us." Dean was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know what it's like to not bury your father right." The kid's eyes widened. "You too?" "Yeah." Dean looked at the casket, at the man who'd raised 5 kids in a 2-bedroom house and worked until his back gave out. "Me too." They sat in silence for a minute. Then the kid stood and held out his hand. "My grandfather would have liked you," the kid said. "I would have liked him too." Dean left the funeral home and drove straight to Forest Lawn. He hadn't been there in 8 years. He parked, walked through the gates, found the section he'd been avoiding since 1954. His father's grave was simple. Gaetano Crosetti, 1894 to 1954. Beloved father. Dean stood there looking at it. Notice something here, because this is the part that explains everything that came before it. Dean's father had died alone in a charity hospital while Dean was in Vegas, performing, making money, living the life Gaetano had worked his whole life to make possible. Dean had paid for the funeral, $3,000, top of the line, expensive casket, flowers, the works, but he'd done it through his lawyer. Hadn't come himself, hadn't stood at the graveside, hadn't spoken, had sent money instead of showing up because he was busy, because he had a show, because Frank needed him for something, because he convinced himself his father would understand. And his father had understood. That was the worst part. Even dying, even knowing his son wasn't coming, Gaetano had told the nurses, "He's working, he's busy. I'm proud of him." Dean had carried that for 8 years. The knowledge that his father had died proud of a son who couldn't be bothered to show up. The shame of having money for an expensive funeral, but no time to attend it. The math that said $3,000 could buy a casket, but couldn't buy back an hour to say goodbye. And then 3 days ago, he'd seen a man collapse on a sidewalk because he didn't have $800, and he'd watched that man go into a funeral home knowing he'd failed his father. And Dean had seen himself in that moment, not the version who failed, but the version who got a second chance to fix it. That's why he'd given the money. That's why he'd gone to the funeral. That's why he'd sat in the back row and listened to a stranger's son talk about shame and burden and doing right by your father. Because Dean couldn't fix what he'd done, couldn't go back to 1954 and show up, couldn't undo the choice to send money instead of himself, but he could make sure someone else didn't carry the same weight, could make sure Henry Castellano's son stood at that grave without shame, could give someone else the thing Dean had thrown away. He knelt in front of his father's headstone. "I should have been here," he said quietly. "You deserved better than what I gave you. Better than money. Better than an empty chair at your funeral." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Pop. I'm sorry I didn't come. I'm sorry it took me 8 years to say that." The October wind picked up. Leaves skittered across the graves. Dean stood there for maybe 10 minutes. Then he did something he'd never done, not once in 8 years of avoiding this place. He sat down on the grass, back against the headstone, and talked to his father. Told him about the man on the sidewalk, about the funeral, about the grandson who'd said his great-grandfather had carried shame his whole life because he couldn't bury his father right. "I get it now," Dean said. "Why you told the nurses you were proud of me, even though I wasn't there. You didn't want me carrying it. Didn't want me to spend my life like your father did, weighted down by something I couldn't change. You understood I had to work, had to perform, had to be somewhere else." He paused. "But you still died alone, and I'll carry that forever. Not because you'd want me to, but because I should. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think." Dean drove back to his hotel that night and sat in the bar until it closed. Frank found him there around midnight, tie loosened, drink in hand, staring at nothing. "You okay?" Frank asked. "Yeah." "You sure? You've been weird all week." Dean looked at his drink. "You ever think about the stuff we didn't do? The people we didn't show up for because we were working?" Frank sat down. "Where's this coming from?" "Just thinking." They sat in silence for a minute. Then Frank said, "My old man died in '51. I was on tour, couldn't make it back in time. Missed the whole thing." He turned his glass. "Still think about it." "You ever go to the grave?" "Once right after. Haven't been back since." "Why not?" Frank shrugged. "What's the point? He's not there. It's just a stone." Dean thought about that. Thought about Henry Castellano's casket and the man who'd almost been unable to bury him. Thought about his own father's grave and the 8 years he'd avoided it. "Maybe the point isn't for them," Dean said. "Maybe it's for us." Frank looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right." The next morning, Dean drove back to Forest Lawn. He bought flowers from a stand outside the gates, carnations, his father's favorite. He put them on the grave and sat there for an hour, just sitting, not talking, just being present in a way he hadn't been able to be 8 years earlier. A man walked past with flowers of his own, heading to another grave. He nodded at Dean. Dean nodded back. Two men visiting their dead. Nothing unusual about it, nothing dramatic, just the quiet ritual of showing up. That became Dean's routine. Once a month, sometimes more, he'd drive to Forest Lawn, bring flowers, sit for a while. Never told anyone about it, just went. Sometimes he'd talk, sometimes he'd sit in silence. Either way, he was there. That was the point. Years later, after Frank died, Dean stood at his grave and thought about that night in the bar. About Frank saying, "What's the point?" And Dean saying, "Maybe it's for us." And he wished Frank had understood that before it was too late. Wished he'd gone back to his father's grave more than once. Wished he'd known that showing up late is still showing up. But mostly Dean thought about Henry Castellano, about a man who worked 40 years in a steel mill and raised 5 kids in a 2-bedroom house and died believing in family and hard work and helping people who needed it. About his son who collapsed on a sidewalk because he couldn't afford $800. About a grandson who said a man who doesn't bury his father right carries that shame forever. Dean never saw them again, never looked for them, never asked what happened to the money, or whether the son ever stopped blaming himself, or whether the grandson grew up to be the kind of man his great-grandfather wanted him to be. But sometimes, driving past that funeral home, Dean would slow down, would look at those brass-handled doors, would remember a man on his knees and $300 blowing down the sidewalk in the October wind. And he'd remember the choice he'd made, not to fix his own past, that was impossible, but to make sure someone else didn't carry the same weight, to give a stranger the thing Dean had thrown away, the chance to bury his father right, to show up, to be present, to not spend the rest of his life wondering what it would have been like if he had. That was worth $500, worth missing a meeting, worth being late to the sands, worth everything.